A billionaire CEO gets an anonymous text message. Hi, sir. If what my mom says is true, you're my dad. Initially dismissing it as either a prank or a mistake, he freezes in shock at what the next message says. Jonathan Davenport sank deeper into the plush leather chair in his penthouse office, the city's skyline glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was late, well past midnight, but the work never seemed to end. His assistant had left hours ago, and the only sounds were the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic click of his pen tapping against his desk. He rubbed his temples, a dull ache forming after yet another grueling day of meetings, decisions, and the weight of his multi-billion-dollar empire. Just as he considered packing up, his phone buzzed on the desk. A text, he thought. Likely another investor trying to pull his attention, or maybe a late-night update from his legal team. He grabbed the phone and unlocked it, his brows furrowing at the message on the screen. Hi, sir. If what my mom says is true, you're my dad. Jonathan stared at the words, his initial reaction a mixture of irritation and disbelief. What kind of scam was this? Or was it a joke? He sighed, tossing the phone aside. People will try anything these days, he muttered under his breath, already prepared to block the number. A few moments later, the phone buzzed again. Annoyed, he snatched it up, intending to put an end to this nonsense. But when he read the second text, his hand froze. She said you met at Willow Creek Cafe 12 years ago. You like blueberry pie, just like me. Jonathan's chest tightened. Willow Creek Cafe. Blueberry pie. The words hung in the air like ghosts of a past he hadn't thought about in years. Memories rushed back unbidden, her laughter, the warm glow of the cafe, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her art. Rebecca. For a moment, he was back in that small, unassuming cafe in the quiet town he had visited during a rare weekend off. He'd been there for a company retreat, trying to escape the suffocating pressures of his burgeoning career. She had been a local artist, spirited and kind, with paint-smeared hands and a contagious enthusiasm for life. They had shared conversations that lingered late into the night, and yes, they had shared a slice of blueberry pie. Jonathan shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. His jaw clenched as he reread the message. It had to be a coincidence, or a very calculated lie. But as much as he tried to dismiss it, doubt crept in. Could it be true? Could Rebecca have? He leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the phone. Logic told him it was absurd. If she'd had his child, wouldn't she have reached out? Rebecca wasn't the type to keep secrets, at least, not the Rebecca he had known. But that had been over a decade ago. People change. He pulled up the text again, his thumb hovering over the reply button. 1,000 questions raced through his mind, but he couldn't bring himself to type a single word. What if this was real? What would he even say? Instead, he closed the message and opened a search engine, typing in her name. Rebecca Holloway. His heart pounded as he scrolled through the results. There were mentions of a few local art exhibits and a social media account that hadn't been updated in years. No sign of a child, no clues to explain the text. Frustrated, he leaned back and ran a hand through his hair. The text buzzed again. I'm sorry if this is a bad time. I didn't mean to bother you. I just wanted to know if it's true. Jonathan's throat tightened. The words carried a vulnerability that was hard to ignore. This wasn't the tone of a scammer or a prankster. It felt real. He exhaled sharply, his mind warring with itself. He wanted to ignore it, to push it aside and focus on his work. But he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this deserved more than a passing glance. If there was even a shred of truth to this, he owed it to himself, and to whoever sent the message, to find out. Finally, he replied, "Who are you?" The response was almost immediate. "My name is Ethan. I'm 11. My mom is Rebecca Holloway." Jonathan's heart thudded in his chest. Ethan. 11. That would match the timeline. He closed his eyes, his thoughts spinning out of control. The implications were staggering. If Ethan was his son, what did that mean for the life he had built? For the life he had missed? He couldn't sit still any longer. Rising from his chair, he paced the room, the familiar sensation of control slipping through his fingers. He had built his empire on precision, on calculated decisions. But this was chaos. Personal, emotional, unpredictable case. As he stared out at the city, a thought struck him with chilling clarity. If Ethan truly was his son, Rebecca had kept him in the dark for over a decade. Had she tried to contact him? Had he unknowingly ignored some attempt to reach out? Or had she chosen to raise Ethan alone, deciding he was better off without Jonathan in his life? The phone buzzed again. "I just thought you should know. I won't bother you anymore if you don't want me to." Jonathan sank back into his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. For the first time in years, he felt completely unmoored. The decisions he made in the coming days could change everything, not just for him, but for Ethan, for Rebecca, for the fragile thread of connection that had just been unearthed. He stared at the screen, his hand trembling slightly as he typed his response. "This isn't a conversation for text. I need to speak to your mother." There was no immediate reply this time. As the minutes stretched into hours, Jonathan remained seated, staring at his phone, waiting for a message that might redefine his entire life. Jonathan barely slept that night. He remained at his desk long after the city lights began to dim and the streets below fell silent. The message from Ethan replayed in his mind, intertwining with memories of Rebecca he thought he had long buried. Each thought gnawed at him, her warm laugh, the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about her dreams, and the quiet moments they'd shared over coffee and blueberry pie. He had once considered her the kind of person who brought balance to his chaotic life. But their worlds were too different. He was on the verge of a meteoric rise in his career, consumed by ambition, while she thrived in simplicity, finding joy in her art and small-town community. Their time together had been brief, and when they parted, it had felt inevitable. At least, that's what he told himself. Now, he wasn't so sure. The next morning, he sat in his car, staring at the glowing screen of his phone. The reply he had sent the night before, asking to speak to Rebecca, had gone unanswered. The silence only added to his unease. Was she avoiding him? Or was this just some cruel misunderstanding? Determined to get answers, Jonathan called his assistant. "Michael, I need you to track down someone for me. Rebecca Holloway. She's an artist. Lived near Willow Creek about 12 years ago. I need her current address, phone number, anything you can find." Michael hesitated on the other end of the line, unaccustomed to such a personal request from his usually unflappable boss. "Of course, sir. I'll prioritize it." Jonathan ended the call, his chest tightening. He had no idea what he would say to Rebecca if, or when, he found her. But he couldn't let this go. If Ethan was his son, he deserved to know the truth. More importantly, Ethan deserved to know why he had been absent all these years. By the time Michael called back later that afternoon, Jonathan had run through every possible scenario in his head. "I found her, sir," Michael said. "Rebecca Holloway. She lives in Cedar Hill, a few hours from here. I've got an address and a phone number." Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. "Thank you, Michael. Send me the details." The email arrived moments later, and Jonathan immediately scanned the information. Rebecca lived in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Her online presence was sparse, mostly mentions of small art exhibitions and a handful of local community projects. There was no mention of Ethan. Without giving himself time to second-guess, Jonathan grabbed his keys and headed to his car. The drive to Cedar Hill was long, but he welcomed the solitude. The familiar hum of the road gave him time to gather his thoughts, though it did little to calm his nerves. When he pulled onto Rebecca's street, he felt a pang of apprehension. The neighborhood was quaint, with neatly trimmed lawns and cozy houses that spoke of a slower, simpler life. He parked his car a short distance from the address and sat for a moment, staring at the modest home. His heart thumped loudly in his chest. What if she slammed the door in his face? What if she refused to talk to him? Or worse, what if she confirmed that Ethan was his son and he had to face the consequences of a life he hadn't known he was part of? Steeling himself, he stepped out of the car and walked up to the house. The porch was adorned with potted plants and wind chimes, a reflection of the Rebecca he remembered. He hesitated for only a moment before knocking on the door. The sound of approaching footsteps made his pulse quicken. The door creaked open, and there she was. Rebecca looked much the same as she had 12 years ago, though the years had softened her. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a loose braid, and her eyes, though tired, still held that familiar warmth. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. "Jonathan," she said, her voice tinged with both astonishment and caution. "Rebecca," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Can we talk?" She hesitated, glancing behind her as if weighing her options. Finally, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The house smelled faintly of lavender and fresh paint, and the walls were adorned with her artwork, landscapes, abstracts, and portraits that spoke of a life lived creatively. They sat in the small living room, the silence between them heavy. Rebecca folded her hands in her lap, her posture guarded. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said finally, breaking the tension. "Neither did I," Jonathan admitted. "But I got a message last night. From Ethan." Her face paled, and she looked away. "I told him not to. I told him it wasn't his place." "So it's true," Jonathan said quietly, the weight of her unspoken confirmation settling over him. "Ethan is my son." Rebecca nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes." For a moment, Jonathan couldn't speak. The reality of it hit him like a tidal wave. He had a son. A son he had never known about, never seen, never held. The enormity of what he had missed was staggering. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice tinged with hurt and confusion. Rebecca took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I wanted to. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought about calling you. But you were already so consumed by your work, your ambitions. I didn't think you'd want us. And by the time I realized I might have been wrong, it felt too late. Ethan was already here, and we had our life." Jonathan's jaw tightened, a mixture of anger and regret coursing through him. "You should have let me decide." "I know," Rebecca said softly. "And I'm sorry. But I did what I thought was best for him." He looked at her, his emotions warring between resentment and understanding. She had been right in a way. 12 years ago, he might not have been ready for this. But now everything was different. "Does he know?" Jonathan asked. "Does Ethan know who I am?" Rebecca nodded. "I've told him about you. He's always been curious, especially as he got older. But I never wanted him to feel unwanted, so I kept it simple." Jonathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Rebecca, I need to get to know him. If he's my son, I can't just walk away from this." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself a small, tentative smile. "I'd like that. For him. But this won't be easy, Jonathan. He's a good kid, but it's a lot for him." Jonathan nodded, determination settling in his chest. "I'll take it one step at a time. I just want to be there for him." Rebecca studied him for a moment, as if searching for something in his eyes. Finally she said, "Okay. But promise me one thing." "What's that?" he asked. "Promise me you won't disappear. If you're going to be in his life, be in it for good." Jonathan met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. "I promise." Jonathan sat in his car outside Rebecca's house the next morning, the sun rising slowly over the sleepy neighborhood. He had spent the night in a modest hotel nearby, too restless to make the drive back to the city after their conversation. His mind was still reeling from everything she had revealed. He had a son, Ethan, and he had spent the last 11 years completely oblivious. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. He wasn't sure how to approach this new reality, but one thing was clear: he had to meet Ethan. Rebecca had agreed, albeit hesitantly, and the prospect left Jonathan both eager and apprehensive. What would Ethan think of him? Would he be angry, confused, or indifferent? The uncertainty gnawed at him. When Rebecca opened the door again, she looked more composed than the night before. She had on a simple sweater and jeans, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Morning," she said softly, her tone still cautious but not unkind. "Come in." Jonathan followed her inside, the familiar scent of lavender and paint filling the air. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of cartoons coming from another room. Rebecca led him to the living room, gesturing for him to sit. "I told Ethan you were coming," she said, sitting across from him. "He's nervous, but he's excited too." Jonathan nodded, his throat tightening. "I'm nervous too," he admitted. "I don't want to overwhelm him." Rebecca smiled faintly. "Just be yourself. He's curious about you. He's always wanted to know more about where he came from." Jonathan was about to respond when a small figure appeared in the doorway. Ethan stood there, his eyes wide as he looked at Jonathan. He was a wiry boy with tousled brown hair and bright blue eyes that were unmistakably Jonathan's. The resemblance was uncanny, and it hit Jonathan like a bolt of lightning. This was his son. "Ethan," Rebecca said gently. "This is Jonathan." Ethan hesitated, glancing at his mother before stepping into the room. "Hi," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan smiled, trying to put the boy at ease. "Hi, Ethan. It's nice to meet you." Ethan nodded, his hands fidgeting nervously. Rebecca motioned for him to sit next to her on the couch, and he did, still eyeing Jonathan with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "I hear you like blueberry pie," Jonathan said, his tone light. "Your mom and I used to share a slice every time we went to Willow Creek Cafe." Ethan's face lit up just slightly, a flicker of excitement breaking through his shyness. "Yeah," he said. "Mom says I got that from you." Jonathan chuckled, feeling a pang of warmth. "It's a good thing to inherit." The room fell quiet for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over all of them. Jonathan decided to take a different approach, one that might help Ethan feel more comfortable. "I brought something," he said, reaching into the bag he had brought with him. He pulled out a small puzzle box, the kind he used to love as a child. "I thought maybe we could work on this together, if you're up for it." Ethan's eyes lit up, and he glanced at his mother, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Okay," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Jonathan set the puzzle on the coffee table, and the two of them leaned over it, studying the pieces. As they worked together, the tension in the room began to ease. Ethan grew more animated, asking Jonathan questions about how to solve certain parts, and Jonathan found himself genuinely enjoying the interaction. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. Rebecca watched from the couch, her expression softening as she saw the two of them connecting. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. After about an hour, they completed the puzzle, and Ethan beamed with pride. "We did it," he said, looking up at Jonathan with a grin. Jonathan smiled back, his heart swelling. "We make a good team." Ethan hesitated for a moment before blurting out, "Do you like puzzles too?" "I love them," Jonathan said. "I used to do them all the time when I was your age." Ethan's smile widened, and for the first time, Jonathan felt a glimmer of hope that this relationship could grow into something meaningful. Rebecca interrupted gently. "Ethan, why don't you go wash up? Lunch will be ready soon." Ethan nodded and stood, giving Jonathan one last curious look before disappearing down the hall. Once he was out of earshot, Rebecca turned to Jonathan. "Thank you for being patient with him," she said. "He's not used to all of this." Jonathan nodded, his gaze lingering on the hallway where Ethan had disappeared. "He's a great kid. I can already see that." Rebecca smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "He's been asking about you for years. I always told him you were busy with important things, but that you cared about him in your own way. I didn't know how else to explain it." Jonathan looked at her, guilt washing over him. "I wish I had known. I would have. I don't know what I would have done, but I wouldn't have ignored it." "I believe you," Rebecca said softly. "And I know this isn't easy for you either." But he's been waiting for this moment for a long time. I just want you to know how much it means to him, to both of us. Jonathan nodded, his jaw tightening. I'm not going anywhere, Rebecca. I want to be part of his life. She studied him for a moment before nodding. Then let's take it one step at a time. They ate lunch together, a simple meal that felt surprisingly comfortable despite the circumstances. Ethan chatted more freely now, asking Jonathan about his work and his favorite things. Jonathan found himself answering with an honesty he hadn't expected, enjoying the boy's genuine curiosity. As the day went on, Jonathan felt a sense of connection forming. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its challenges, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in years he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. When it was time to leave, Ethan hugged him awkwardly but sincerely. Are you coming back? He asked, his eyes filled with hope. Jonathan crouched down to meet his gaze. I'll be back soon, he promised. I meant what I said, I'm not going anywhere. Ethan nodded, his smile small but genuine. Okay. As Jonathan walked back to his car, Rebecca followed him to the door. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet. For showing up. For trying. Jonathan met her gaze, his expression earnest. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Rebecca nodded, and as he drove away, Jonathan felt a strange but welcome sensation settle over him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The days after Jonathan's first visit passed in a blur of reflection and planning. He replayed every moment with Ethan, from the shy greeting to the way the boy's face lit up as they worked on the puzzle. It was a small connection, but it had felt monumental. Jonathan was determined to build on it, though he knew it wouldn't be easy. Rebecca had made it clear that any involvement in Ethan's life needed to be consistent, and Jonathan took that promise seriously. The following weekend, Jonathan drove back to Cedar Hill with a mix of excitement and nerves. He had spent the week researching activities Ethan might enjoy, wanting to be prepared. When he arrived at Rebecca's house, she greeted him at the door, her expression guarded but polite. Ethan's in the backyard, she said, stepping aside to let him in. He's been looking forward to seeing you. Jonathan smiled, relieved to hear that. Thanks for letting me come by again. She nodded but didn't say more, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. He could sense her caution, the unspoken fear that he might not follow through. It only strengthened his resolve to prove her wrong. He found Ethan outside, crouched in the grass with a small soccer ball at his feet. The boy looked up as Jonathan approached, a mixture of shyness and anticipation in his expression. Hey, Ethan, Jonathan said, his tone warm but casual. Ready for round 2? Ethan smiled faintly, nudging the ball with his foot. Do you play soccer? Jonathan chuckled. I haven't played in a while, but I can give it a shot. Think you can teach me some moves? Ethan nodded, his confidence growing. Okay. I'll show you. They spent the next hour kicking the ball back and forth, with Ethan occasionally stopping to explain a rule or demonstrate a trick. Jonathan wasn't particularly skilled, but he threw himself into the game with genuine enthusiasm, earning a few laughs from Ethan when he stumbled or missed a kick. By the time they took a break, Ethan was more relaxed, his initial shyness replaced by a budding sense of trust. They sat on the grass, catching their breath. You're not very good at soccer, Ethan said matter-of-factly, though his tone was playful. Jonathan laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. You're right about that. Maybe you can give me some more lessons next time. Maybe, Ethan said, his smile widening. But you have to practice. Deal, Jonathan said, feeling a swell of pride at the progress they were making. Rebecca watched them from the kitchen window, her arms crossed as she leaned against the counter. She couldn't deny that Jonathan was trying. He had shown up, just as he promised, and he was putting in the effort to connect with Ethan. But part of her couldn't shake the worry that it might not last. Jonathan's world was so far removed from theirs. How long could he keep this up before the demands of his life pulled him away again? Later, when Ethan went inside to grab a snack, Jonathan took the opportunity to speak with Rebecca. She met him on the porch, her expression guarded. He's warming up to you, she said, her tone neutral. Jonathan nodded. I can tell. He's a great kid, Rebecca. You've done an amazing job raising him. Rebecca softened slightly at the compliment, but remained cautious. He's been through a lot. I've tried to shield him from disappointment, but... Her voice trailed off, and Jonathan could sense the weight of her fears. He stepped closer, his voice steady. I meant what I said. I'm not going anywhere. I know I've missed a lot, and I can't change that. But I'm here now, and I'm going to be part of his life. Rebecca searched his face for a long moment before nodding. I hope you mean that. Because if you leave, it's not just me you'll hurt. It's him. Jonathan swallowed hard, the gravity of her words sinking in. I know. And I won't. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan continued to visit regularly. He brought small gifts for Ethan, a book on puzzles, a basketball, and even a beginner's guide to chess. They spent hours together, discovering shared interests and building a rhythm. Ethan opened up more with each visit, peppering Jonathan with questions about his life and work. Do you have a lot of meetings? Ethan asked one afternoon as they sat at the kitchen table, working on a puzzle together. Too many, Jonathan admitted with a laugh. But it's part of the job. Do you like it? Ethan pressed, his eyes curious. Jonathan hesitated, caught off guard by the question. I like parts of it, he said finally. But sometimes I think I've spent too much time working and not enough time, well, doing other things. Like soccer? Ethan teased, grinning. Exactly, Jonathan said, smiling back. Or spending time with people who matter. Ethan's expression grew thoughtful, and he nodded as if filing the answer away. Jonathan felt a pang of emotion, realizing just how much he wanted to be one of those people who mattered to Ethan. Rebecca observed their interactions from a distance, her reservations slowly easing. She could see the effort Jonathan was putting in and the joy it brought Ethan. Still, she couldn't help but worry about the long term. Jonathan's life was a world of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. Could he truly make space for them in that world? Jonathan had just left Rebecca's house after a weekend visit when his phone buzzed incessantly on the passenger seat. He frowned, glancing at the screen during a red light. A string of notifications from his assistant, and a few news alerts lit up the screen. Jonathan, call me as soon as you can. It's urgent. Media inquiry regarding personal matters, need a statement. Tabloids are running a story about you and a son. We need damage control. His stomach sank. Jonathan pulled over into a parking lot, opened one of the links his assistant had sent, and stared at the headline. Billionaire CEO Jonathan Davenport's secret son? Mystery woman and child surface in small town. The accompanying article was filled with speculation, intrusive details about Rebecca's life, and even a grainy photo of Ethan walking into his school. Jonathan's jaw tightened as he read, anger boiling under the surface. How had this gotten out? By the time he reached his penthouse, his mind was racing. He called Rebecca immediately. She picked up on the second ring, her voice taut with worry. Jonathan, what's happening? There are photographers outside the house. They were at Ethan's school this morning. He's terrified. I just saw the articles, Jonathan said, pacing the room. I don't know how this got out, but I'm going to fix it. I'll make sure they leave you and Ethan alone. Rebecca's voice was sharp. How, Jonathan? This is your world, not ours. I've spent years keeping Ethan out of the spotlight, and now it's all crashing down on us. Jonathan stopped pacing, her words cutting him deeply. I'm so sorry, Rebecca. This wasn't supposed to happen. I'll do whatever it takes to protect you both. Rebecca sighed, exhaustion clear in her tone. Just make it stop. Ethan doesn't understand what's happening, and I don't know how to explain it to him. Jonathan ended the call, his resolve hardening. He contacted his PR team and legal counsel, instructing them to issue a statement demanding privacy for his family. He also hired private security to monitor Rebecca's house and Ethan's school. The measures were immediate, but they didn't solve the deeper problem, the invasive nature of his public life. The next day, Jonathan drove back to Cedar Hill. When he arrived, Rebecca greeted him at the door, her face a mixture of relief and frustration. "I told Ethan you'd be here," she said. "He's been asking for you." Jonathan nodded, guilt gnawing at him. "Where is he?" "In his room," Rebecca said. "But before you go in, we need to talk." She gestured for him to sit in the living room, and he followed, bracing himself for what was coming. Rebecca sat across from him, her arms crossed tightly. "I know you're doing everything you can to fix this, and I appreciate that," she began. "But this is exactly why I kept Ethan out of your world for so long. I didn't want him to be dragged into this kind of chaos." Jonathan met her gaze, his expression earnest. "I understand that now. I didn't fully realize what you were protecting him from, but I see it. And I'm going to do everything I can to make this right." Rebecca sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I don't want to keep you from him, Jonathan. But you need to understand how hard this is for us. I've spent years building a life for Ethan where he feels safe. I won't let anything jeopardize that." "You're right," Jonathan said. "And I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner. I'll make sure he stays safe. That's my priority." Rebecca studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Okay. Let's see how this goes." When Jonathan entered Ethan's room, he found the boy sitting on the bed, flipping through one of the puzzle books Jonathan had given him. Ethan looked up, his face lighting up briefly before a shadow of worry crossed his features. "Hey, buddy," Jonathan said, sitting beside him. "How are you holding up?" Ethan shrugged, his gaze dropping to the book. "There were cameras at school," he said quietly. "They kept taking pictures of me. Why do they care about me?" Jonathan's chest tightened. He hated that Ethan had been put in this position. "They don't have the right to do that," he said firmly. "And I'm doing everything I can to make them stop. You don't deserve this." Ethan looked up at him, his eyes wide and searching. "Is it because of you? Because you're, like, famous?" Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. "It's because of my job, yes. Some people think that means they can write stories about me and the people I care about. But they're wrong. And I'm going to make sure they leave you and your mom alone." Ethan was quiet for a moment before leaning against Jonathan's side. "I just want things to go back to normal." Jonathan wrapped an arm around him, his heart aching. "I know, buddy. And I'll do everything I can to make that happen." Over the next few weeks, Jonathan worked tirelessly to shield Rebecca and Ethan from further scrutiny. He ramped up security measures, hired a lawyer to issue cease and desist letters to media outlets, and publicly condemned the invasion of their privacy. Slowly, the attention began to die down, though the scars it left were harder to erase. Through it all, Jonathan gained a deeper appreciation for Rebecca's sacrifices. She had spent over a decade shielding Ethan from the world's harshest edges, often at great personal cost. Her quiet strength and unwavering dedication humbled him. One evening, as they sat together on the porch after Ethan had gone to bed, Jonathan turned to Rebecca. "You've been through so much for him," he said. "I don't think I ever fully understood what that meant until now." Rebecca looked at him, her expression softening. "He's my son. I'd do anything for him. And now that you're here, I just want to make sure he has the same from you." "You have my word," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "I'm here for good. No matter what it takes." Rebecca nodded, a hint of trust returning to her eyes. "Then we'll get through this. Together." As the night deepened and the stars flickered above, Jonathan felt a sense of clarity. His world had shifted irrevocably, and for the first time, he welcomed the change. Protecting Rebecca and Ethan wasn't just an obligation, it was the most important thing he had ever done. And he was determined to prove himself worthy of their trust. The media frenzy had finally died down, but its aftershocks lingered in the small, quiet moments. Ethan had grown more subdued in recent weeks, his natural curiosity tempered by the scrutiny he'd been exposed to. Jonathan noticed it in the way Ethan hesitated before answering questions at school events, or how he stuck closer to Rebecca during their outings, his eyes darting nervously at any unfamiliar face. Jonathan had been trying to give him space, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had formed. But it gnawed at him. He had seen glimpses of the lively, curious boy Ethan was during their first weeks together, and he hated that his presence, or the complications it had brought, seemed to have dulled that spark. One rainy afternoon, as Jonathan arrived for his weekend visit, he found Ethan in his room, sitting cross-legged on the floor and building something with his Lego set. The boy looked up as Jonathan knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Hey, champ," Jonathan said, stepping inside. "What are you working on?" "Just a spaceship," Ethan mumbled without looking up, his focus on snapping two pieces together. His tone was distracted, and his usual excitement at sharing his creations was missing. Jonathan sat down beside him on the carpet. "Looks pretty cool. Is it for a mission, or just exploring?" "Just exploring," Ethan said, shrugging. He glanced at Jonathan, then back at his project. "You can help if you want." Jonathan smiled, grateful for the invitation. He picked up a handful of pieces, sorting them as Ethan continued to build. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic clicking of Lego bricks the only sound between them. It was peaceful, but Jonathan could feel something unspoken hanging in the air. Finally, he set down a piece and turned to Ethan. "You've been quiet lately," he said gently. "Is something bothering you?" Ethan didn't answer at first, his hands still working on the spaceship. But Jonathan saw the way his shoulders tensed and how his brow furrowed in concentration. "Is it about everything that happened with the cameras and the articles?" Jonathan pressed, keeping his tone soft. "It's okay to tell me how you feel. I want to help." Ethan sighed and finally set down the piece he was holding. "It's not just that," he said, his voice small. "I just feel weird." Jonathan frowned. "Weird how?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, drawing his knees to his chest. "Like, I don't know if I'm doing everything right. Like maybe you'll get tired of me or something." The words hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. "Ethan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Why would you think that?" Ethan hesitated, staring down at the floor. "Because you're this big, important guy, and I'm just me. What if I'm not enough? What if you decide you don't want to come back?" Jonathan felt his throat tighten as he processed the boy's fears. He moved closer, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Listen to me," he said firmly but kindly. "You are more than enough, Ethan. You're my son, and that's all that matters. I don't care about anything else." Ethan looked up at him, his eyes shining with uncertainty. "But you're always busy. You have so much to do. What if there's no room for me?" Jonathan knelt in front of him, meeting his gaze directly. "Ethan, I've been busy for a long time, but do you know why I'm here now? Because you're more important than anything else in my life. My work doesn't matter as much as being your dad. That's the truth." Ethan blinked, and Jonathan could see the emotions bubbling to the surface. "I don't need you to be perfect," the boy said, his voice trembling. "I just need you to be there." Jonathan felt a lump rise in his throat. He reached out and pulled Ethan into a hug, holding him tightly. "I'm here," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "And I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to worry about that." Ethan clung to him for a moment before pulling back, a small, hesitant smile breaking through the doubt on his face. "Okay," he said quietly. Jonathan smiled back, ruffling the boy's hair. "Okay." Later that evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Jonathan sat in the living room with Rebecca. The rain had slowed, leaving a faint patter against the windows as they talked. "He's been carrying a lot of fear," Rebecca said, her voice soft. "I didn't realize how much it was affecting him until recently." Jonathan nodded, his expression serious. "It's my fault. I brought all this attention into his life. I thought I was doing the right thing by stepping in, but I didn't think about how much it would disrupt everything." "It's not just about the attention," Rebecca said. "He's still trying to figure out where you fit in his life. And honestly, so am I." Jonathan looked at her, her words striking a chord. He had spent so much of his life striving to be the best at everything he did, his career, his reputation, his success. But fatherhood wasn't something he could approach with the same mentality. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being present, about showing up, even when it was hard. That night, as he lay awake in the guest room, Jonathan found himself reflecting on his priorities. His life in the city, with its endless meetings and high-stakes deals, felt increasingly hollow compared to the time he spent with Ethan. For so long, he had defined himself by his achievements, but now, those achievements felt meaningless without the relationships he was trying to build. The next morning, as he packed his things to leave, Jonathan made a decision. He couldn't undo the mistakes of the past, but he could reshape the future. For Ethan's sake, and his own, he would make fatherhood his priority. Everything else would come second. As he hugged Ethan goodbye and promised to return soon, Jonathan felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to walk it, for Ethan, for Rebecca, and for himself. Jonathan had settled into his new rhythm, dividing his time between work and visits to Cedar Hill. The connection between him and Ethan had grown stronger, the boy's shy hesitations replaced with a playful curiosity that made Jonathan feel like he was finally doing something right. Even Rebecca seemed more at ease, her guarded demeanor softening with each visit. But life has a way of throwing curveballs just when things begin to feel stable. One crisp autumn evening, Jonathan arrived in Cedar Hill for a surprise visit. He had finished a major deal earlier than expected and wanted to spend the weekend with Ethan. Rebecca answered the door, her face lighting up with a mix of surprise and warmth. "You're early," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Ethan's at soccer practice, but he'll be thrilled to see you." Jonathan smiled, setting his bag down. "I thought I'd come by and watch practice. Mind if I tag along?" Rebecca chuckled. "Not at all. He loves it when you're there." They headed to the field together, arriving just as the kids were wrapping up drills. Ethan spotted Jonathan immediately and sprinted toward him, his face lighting up. "Dad!" he called, throwing his arms around Jonathan. Jonathan grinned, ruffling Ethan's hair. "Hey, champ. How's practice?" "Good. I scored a goal earlier. Coach said it was awesome," Ethan said excitedly. "Of course it was. You're a natural," Jonathan said, pride swelling in his chest. As practice ended and the kids began packing up, Jonathan noticed Ethan wince as he bent to pick up his water bottle. The boy rubbed his side, his face briefly twisting in discomfort. "Everything okay, buddy?" Jonathan asked, kneeling to his level. Ethan shrugged. "It just hurts a little. I think I got elbowed during the game yesterday." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Rebecca, who frowned. "Does it still hurt a lot?" she asked, kneeling beside them. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, kinda. But it's not a big deal." Rebecca's concern deepened, and Jonathan's chest tightened. "Let's get it checked out, just to be safe," Jonathan said firmly. Ethan groaned. "I don't need to go to the doctor. It's just to make sure," Rebecca said gently. "Better safe than sorry." Reluctantly, Ethan agreed. They drove to the local clinic, where the doctor examined him and ordered a precautionary X-ray. Jonathan stayed by Ethan's side the entire time, holding his hand and cracking jokes to keep him calm. Rebecca paced in the hallway, her worry evident. When the doctor returned, her expression was serious. She sat down across from them, her tone calm but grave. "The X-ray showed something unusual. It looks like a growth near Ethan's rib cage. It could be a benign cyst, but we need to run further tests to rule out anything more serious." Rebecca's face went pale, and Jonathan felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "What do you mean by more serious?" he asked, his voice low. The doctor hesitated. "It could be a tumor. We won't know for sure until we do additional imaging and possibly a biopsy." Ethan looked between them, his face scrunching in confusion. "What's a tumor?" Jonathan forced himself to stay calm, even though his mind was racing. "It's just something the doctor needs to check out to make sure you're healthy." he said, squeezing Ethan's hand. We're going to figure it out, okay? Rebecca's voice trembled. How soon can we do the tests? I'll schedule them for tomorrow morning, the doctor said. In the meantime, try to keep things as normal as possible for Ethan. The drive home was quiet, the weight of the doctor's words hanging heavily over them. Ethan fell asleep in the back seat, oblivious to the storm of emotions swirling between Jonathan and Rebecca. Once Ethan was tucked into bed, Rebecca sat down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling. Jonathan joined her, his face etched with worry. This can't be happening, she said, her voice breaking. He's just a kid. He's never been sick a day in his life. Jonathan reached across the table, taking her hands in his. We don't know anything yet. It could be nothing. But what if it's not? Rebecca whispered, tears streaming down her face. I can't lose him, Jonathan. He's my whole world. Jonathan's throat tightened, but he kept his voice steady. We're not going to lose him. No matter what this is, we'll face it together. He's strong, Rebecca. And so are we. The next day, they returned to the clinic for more tests. The waiting was excruciating, each minute stretching into an eternity. Jonathan stayed by Ethan's side, cracking jokes and distracting him with stories about his own childhood mishaps. Rebecca hovered nearby, her worry palpable. When the results finally came back, the doctor met with them privately. It's good news, she said, a relieved smile on her face. The growth is a benign cyst. It's not cancerous, but it will need to be removed surgically. Jonathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, and Rebecca broke into quiet tears, her relief overwhelming. Ethan, who had been listening intently, looked up at Jonathan. Does this mean I'm okay? He asked. Jonathan smiled, ruffling his hair. You're more than okay, buddy. You're tough as nails. The surgery was scheduled for the following week, and Jonathan cleared his entire calendar to be there. On the day of the procedure, he sat with Rebecca in the waiting room, holding her hand as they waited for news. When the surgeon finally emerged with a reassuring smile, they both exhaled in unison. The surgery went perfectly, the surgeon said. Ethan's going to be just fine. The relief that flooded through Jonathan was indescribable. When they were allowed to see Ethan, he was groggy but smiling, his first words making both of them laugh. Does this mean I can't play soccer for a while? He asked. Rebecca wiped her tears, chuckling. Maybe just a little break, kiddo. Jonathan leaned down, kissing the top of Ethan's head. You gave us quite the scare, champ. But you're the bravest kid I know. As the days passed and Ethan recovered, Jonathan found himself reflecting on the experience. The fear of losing Ethan had crystallized something for him. Nothing mattered more than being there for his son. The demands of his career paled in comparison to the moments he spent with Ethan and Rebecca, and he vowed to never let anything come between them again. Ethan's recovery brought a renewed sense of peace to their lives. The days following his surgery were filled with laughter and relief as the family fell into a comfortable rhythm. Rebecca's house had become a haven, a place where the noise of Jonathan's high-profile world seemed to fade away. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt truly present, unburdened by the weight of his responsibilities. It was a crisp, sunny Saturday when Jonathan arrived for one of his now regular visits. He stepped out of his car, holding a large box wrapped in bright paper, its edges slightly crumpled from the drive. Rebecca opened the door, her eyes widening at the sight. What's that? She asked, laughing as he struggled to balance the box and his overnight bag. It's a surprise, Jonathan said, grinning. Where's Ethan? In the backyard, Rebecca said, stepping aside to let him in. He's been waiting for you all morning. Jonathan set the box down carefully on the living room floor and made his way to the backyard. Ethan was sitting on the grass, a book open in his lap, his face glowing when he saw Jonathan. Dad! He called, jumping up and running toward him. Jonathan scooped him up in a hug, holding him tightly. Hey, champ! How's my favorite soccer star? Better, Ethan said, grinning. The doctor said I can start playing again next week. That's amazing news, Jonathan said, ruffling his hair. "But I've got something for you today that I think you'll like even more." Ethan's eyes lit up with curiosity. "What is it?" Jonathan led him back into the house, where Rebecca was waiting by the mysterious box. "Go ahead," Jonathan said, motioning for Ethan to open it. Ethan tore at the paper eagerly, revealing a smaller box with hinges. He flipped it open to find a complete chess set, the pieces carved from polished wood. Ethan's eyes widened in amazement. "Whoa," he said, running his fingers over the pieces. "This is so cool." Jonathan smiled, pulling up a chair. "I thought it was time we had a proper match. What do you say?" Ethan beamed. "Let's do it." They set up the board on the coffee table, and Rebecca watched from the couch, a soft smile on her face. The game was slow at first, with Ethan carefully studying each move, but soon he was laughing and teasing Jonathan whenever he captured a piece. "Are you sure you're good at this?" Ethan said with a mischievous grin as he moved his queen into position. "Hey, I'm just going easy on you," Jonathan shot back, though his brow furrowed in mock concentration. "Let's see what you've got." Ethan's laughter filled the room, and for Jonathan, it was the most rewarding sound in the world. When the game ended, with Ethan's triumphant victory, they decided to take a break and head to the kitchen. Jonathan helped Ethan pour lemonade while Rebecca prepared snacks, the three of them falling into an easy rhythm that felt natural and right. As they sat around the table, Jonathan leaned back, watching Rebecca and Ethan chat about their plans for the week. A warmth spread through him, a quiet joy he hadn't known he'd been missing. "I've been thinking about something," Jonathan said, breaking into the conversation. Rebecca and Ethan both turned to him, curious. "What is it?" Rebecca asked. "I'm tired of driving back and forth all the time," Jonathan said. "I was thinking, maybe it's time I found a place here in Cedar Hill. That way, I can be around more often." Ethan's face lit up, and he nearly spilled his lemonade in his excitement. "Really? You'd move here?" Jonathan smiled, nodding. "I don't want to miss any more of your soccer games or chess matches. And honestly, this feels more like home than anywhere else." Rebecca looked at him, her eyes soft with emotion. "That's a big step," she said. "Are you sure?" Jonathan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I've never been more sure of anything. You and Ethan, you're my family. And I want to be here for both of you, every day." For a moment, Rebecca seemed overwhelmed, but then she smiled, squeezing his hand. "Okay," she said softly. "We'd like that." Ethan beamed, his joy infectious. "Can we play chess every weekend?" he asked eagerly. "Every weekend," Jonathan promised. "And every other day, too." The rest of the day was spent celebrating, more games, a trip to Ethan's favorite ice cream shop, and an impromptu soccer match in the backyard that left all three of them breathless and laughing. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they sat together on the porch, watching the world wind down. Ethan leaned against Jonathan, his head resting on his shoulder. "I'm glad you're here, Dad," he said, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. Jonathan wrapped an arm around him, his heart full. "Me too, buddy. Me too." Rebecca watched them from her seat, her heart swelling with gratitude and hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt like they were moving forward, not as individuals navigating their separate worlds, but as a family, united by love and trust. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Jonathan looked out at the peaceful town of Cedar Hill and felt a profound sense of belonging. His life had taken an unexpected turn, one he hadn't seen coming, but he wouldn't trade it for anything. He had found something far greater than success. He had found home. The holiday season arrived in a flurry of lights, music, and festive cheer. Jonathan's company was hosting its annual gala in the heart of the city, a glittering event that had always been a highlight of his calendar. This year, though, it felt different. It wasn't the opulence or the networking opportunities that mattered, it was the two people he would be sharing it with. Jonathan had spent weeks convincing Rebecca to attend, reassuring her that it wasn't about making a public statement or flaunting their lives. "It's about celebrating as a family," he had said, and eventually she had agreed. Ethan, on the other hand, was thrilled. He couldn't wait to see his dad's world up close, even if it meant wearing a suit. When the night arrived, Jonathan picked them up from Cedar Hill in a car decked out with festive ribbons, his heart swelling at the sight of Ethan's wide eyes and Rebecca's elegant, understated beauty. The gala was everything Ethan had imagined: twinkling lights, towering Christmas trees, and tables piled high with decadent treats. As they entered the grand ballroom, Jonathan felt a mix of pride and nerves, knowing the attention they might draw. But when Ethan slipped his hand into his, Jonathan smiled, all his worries fading away. Ethan stayed close to Jonathan's side, taking everything in with wide-eyed wonder. At one point, he spotted a group of classmates from school, boys who had teased him before about not knowing his dad. For a moment, he hesitated, looking up at Jonathan. "Do you want to say hi to them?" Jonathan asked gently. Ethan nodded, his grip tightening on Jonathan's hand. Together, they walked over, and Jonathan knelt to Ethan's level as they approached the group. "Hey guys," Ethan said, his voice steady but shy. "This is my dad." The boys stared, their teasing replaced with wide-eyed awe. Jonathan extended a hand, introducing himself with an easy smile. The kids were too stunned to say much, but Ethan's grin said it all. For the first time, he wasn't just a boy without a dad, he was the kid with a dad who showed up and stood proudly beside him. As the evening wound down, Jonathan led Rebecca and Ethan outside to the venue's garden, where the Christmas lights sparkled like stars against the winter sky. They found a quiet bench beneath a canopy of twinkling lights, and the three of them sat together, bundled against the chill. Ethan leaned into Jonathan's side, his eyes fixed on the lights above. "This is the best Christmas ever," he said softly. Rebecca smiled, her hand resting on Jonathan's. "You've made this a night to remember." Jonathan looked at them, his heart full. In that moment, the accolades and achievements that had once defined him felt small and insignificant. His greatest accomplishment wasn't his company or his wealth, it was the family he had nearly lost but had fought to rebuild. Under the glow of the Christmas lights, with Rebecca and Ethan by his side, Jonathan felt a quiet sense of joy and fulfillment he had never known. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing something. He was exactly where he was meant to be. And it was perfect. As the holiday lights twinkle and the music fades, Jonathan's story reminds us of what truly matters in life: the connections we build, the love we nurture, and the moments we choose to show up for the people who mean the most. It's a testament that no matter how much time has passed or how far we've strayed, it's never too late to rebuild, to reconnect, and to create a future filled with love and purpose. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales like this one. Let us know in the comments, what's one moment in your life that reminded you of what truly matters? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.